The anime begins by showing a young man named Jin Kazama, who is being bullied by 3 other youths in the middle of the forest. Jin was beaten and continuously beaten by the 3 young men until he fell down and suffered many bruises on his face. At first, the 3 youths seemed to underestimate Jin because he did not show any resistance, but that changed when he showed his true fighting ability. Jin got up and immediately aimed a hard kick at the head of one of them until he fell unconscious. 2 other youths who saw this immediately attacked him simultaneously to repay his treatment of their friend. Fortunately, Jin overcame the attacks of the 2 youths and counterattacked until both fell to the ground. Jin had tried to warn the boys to leave, but they kept bothering him, so he had to beat them all up. After successfully knocking them all down, Jin intends to issue a final attack to teach them a lesson, but his mother, Jun Kazama, immediately restrains him and asks him to stop the fight. She warns him not to go too far and invites him back home. When Jin and his mother arrived at their house on the outskirts of the forest, he explained that the 3 young men had attacked him first and sparked the fight. Hearing that, she still couldn't accept that Jin had used the Kazama family's special fighting technique for such a small fight. She was sure Jin was destined for bigger things than dealing with such childish fights. Hearing that, Jin could only be silent for a moment and began questioning why they had to move to such a remote place. He also wanted to know why his mother never wanted to talk about his father and never told him anything about his father. But instead of answering, his mom left the house and asked Jin to finish his homework immediately so they could return to practice as usual. In the afternoon, Jin began to practice martial arts with his mother in their yard to improve his fighting ability. Jun still finds this problem, especially in terms of concentration or focus during the fight. She asked him to always focus on every attack that might appear in front of him and try to always provide surprise attacks. Jun gave an example to Jin by giving a sudden flying kick in the air toward his face. The attack was really hard for him to dodge. She informed him that the kick attack was one of the secret techniques belonging to the Kazama family called the Ryu Unsui technique. Then, Jin learned the technique by following all the movements shown by his mother and kept repeating the movements for a while. After Jin felt that he had mastered the technique, he wanted to try to attack his mother. But when he started to issue the attack, his mother could easily dodge the attack as if she could predict the attack. Therefore, he still did not give up and continued to practice the technique until it got dark and they decided to end the practice. In the evening, after Jin and Jun had dinner together, she advised him to try to control his anger and fight his bad desires. She wants all that Jin has learned and all the training he has gone through so far can be used for the good and benefit of many people. After understanding the meaning of his mother's words, Jin promised that he would try to remember those words in his life. Not long after the conversation, a male demon suddenly appeared in front of their house, and Jun immediately asked Jin to hide. Before facing the demon, she ordered Jin to look for his grandfather, Heihachi Mishima, in the center of the city. Soon afterward, Jun begins to fight against the demon, hoping that Jin will have a chance to escape to a safer place. However, he couldn't let his mother fight alone against the great demon, so he chose to join the fight against the demon. Unfortunately, all of his attacks did not damage the demon. Instead, it was Jin who was thrown hard by the demon's attack until he fainted. The situation got even more chaotic when the demon destroyed the house and ignited a fire that spread throughout the house. Jun, who didn't want the demon to hurt her son, tried to fight and led the demon into the house so she could blow up the demon with her. Even though she had been seriously injured, she kept trying to push the demon with all her strength toward the flames that had devoured the house. After successfully pushing the demon into the house, Jun tries to restrain the demon with the remaining strength she has to protect Jin. At the last second, before she was killed by the explosion with the demon, Jun whispered softly, saying that she loved Jin very much. Moments after the big explosion happened, Jin regained his senses and saw the entire house that had been destroyed and burned down. He tried to find his mother behind the ruins of the house, but he could not find her and was forced to face the harsh reality that his mother had died in the fire. A few days after the incident, Jin went to the city to look for his grandfather, as his mother had ordered him to. After he arrived at his grandfather's house, he introduced himself as Jun Kazama's son and said he came on orders from his mother. After learning that Jin is Jun's son, Heihachi immediately attacks him and asks Jin to fight him. Then, he got up again and attacked Heihachi with several kicks, but the attack was easily parried by Heihachi. All of Jin's attacks continued to miss because Heihachi managed to dodge all of his attacks. On the other hand, all of Heihachi's attacks hit his body and knocked Jin down, causing him to be badly injured. But Jin said that he would not give up. He would continue trying to become stronger to defeat the ogre demon who had killed his mother. Hearing Jin's strong determination, Heihachi intends to train him so that he can kill the ogre demon because that's how he can prove his worthiness to bear the Kazama surname. The following night, Heihachi and Jin began training in an arena that Heihachi had set up in the forest. The first training is prioritized to train the attack power of Jin's punch against the opponent so that he is only allowed to attack using both hands. Heihachi explained that he would help Jin increase his attack power in all parts of his body, from the strength of the hand punch to the power of the foot kick. Hearing this explanation, Jin began to train hard according to Heihachi's instructions and slowly learned to train his strength. Every time he finished training in the arena, he would practice hitting the log repeatedly to increase his attack power like Heihachi. After practicing, Heihachi took Jin to a restaurant for dinner and asked Jin to accompany him to meet a client. When the man who was Heihachi's business partner arrived, the man showed him a special pendant and asked him to buy it at a very high price. But Heihachi refused because it was against their previous agreement, which clearly sparked an argument between them. The man who felt irritated took out a sharp knife to attack Jin. Luckily, he managed to fend off all the attacks and remove the knife from the man's hand even though his right arm was injured. After that, Jin immediately beat the man until he fell unconscious, as ordered by Heihachi. The next day, Jin fights Heihachi in the arena to continue his training. In training that day, Jin will improve the ability of his kicks so that he will be required to attack using only his feet. In between training times, Jin always walks into the city center to practice martial arts with a young man named Warang and chats with a schoolgirl named Xiaoyu, who is also an expert in fighting. Jin followed the same routine every day and underwent every stage of training with discipline for the past 4 years. That night, Heihachi judged that Jin had progressed rapidly and intended to enroll him in a martial arts tournament called the Iron Hand Tournament. Heihachi deliberately held the tournament to provoke the demonic power of the ogre so that Jin could directly fight against the ogre. He was confident in Jin's abilities because, in the battle training that night, Jin had become a much stronger person and possessed extraordinary inner strength. After the training ended, Heihachi ordered his female assistant, Miss Miura, to start preparing everything so that Jin could immediately go to the tournament. A few days later, Jin left for an island that would be the tournament's location using an airplane. Along the way, he discovers many things about the tournament and that his father, Kazuya Mishima, had also participated in the match. But until now, Jin still doesn't know for sure about the location of his father's whereabouts and doesn't know whether his father is still alive or dead. Upon arriving in Peru, Miss Miura, who picked up Jin, warned him not to tell the other participants that he was Mishima's family member because it was too dangerous. When he is about to leave for the arena using a van, Jin discovers that Warang will also participate in the tournament. Warang becomes annoyed because he has to fight against his friend. Along the way to the battle arena, Jin found out about Kazuya and that he had died in the tournament fight against Heihachi. In the afternoon, Jin went to see Heihachi, who had arrived at the arena first, to ask what had really happened to his father. But instead of giving an answer, Heihachi diverted the conversation by asking Jin to focus on the upcoming match and not dwell on past stories. After Heihachi greeted the tournament participants in the arena, he invited the participants to rest for the night because the match was about to start the next day. After Jin left the arena, a male fighter named Paul approached him after learning that he was trying to find out about the match between Kazuya and Heihachi. Paul also says that the fight occurred in the second Iron Fist tournament in the middle of a volcano. Paul still clearly remembers when Heihachi managed to beat and kill Kazuya, but he still didn't think Heihachi had the heart to kill his own son. The next morning, while Heihachi and his men were busy working on the battle chart, Jin barged in to ask if he really killed his father. Soon after, Heihachi admits that, but he explains that he was forced to do all that because he realized that Kazuya had been possessed by the power of an evil demon. That demonic power has made Kazuya even more powerful and almost invincible. Therefore, Heihachi decided to kill Kazuya with his own hands because he knew that Kazuya was too dangerous for many people. Although he actually also understood that most of the demon's power arose because of Kazuya's hatred for him. Heihachi also explained that Jin has a devil gene in him, which is why Jun chose to take Jin to a secluded place and always forbade him to fight. She realized that the power of the devil gene in him could be activated at any time, and that power could provoke the arrival of the demon ogre. Hence, she always warned him not to show his abilities carelessly. Ogres can always sense the presence of the power of the devil gene within a person, and will try their best to defeat that person to absorb the devil gene's power within them. That explanation made Jin feel very guilty about her mother's death, who had sacrificed a lot to protect him. In the afternoon, the Iron Hand tournament began with a duel match between Jin and a world-class martial arts fighter named Leroy Smith. Leroy started the fight with a continuous attack on Jin's head, while Jin could only use self-defense techniques for a short time. But Jin didn't give up and began to attack Leroy with blows, overwhelming him. Every time Jin managed to make him fall to the ground, Jin always asked him to immediately give up in the match. However, because Leroy continued to fight him, he was forced to issue the strongest kick toward Leroy's leg until his bone was broken, so Jin was declared the winner of the match. After the fight ended, Hwarang and Xiaoyu, who also participated in the tournament, tried to approach Jin. However, he looks very gloomy and away from them as if he is not the winner. It seemed that Jin was still not used to the fight. Even though he had practiced thousands of times, it was a new experience for him. Jin tells Hwarang that he has repeatedly warned Leroy to surrender, but he still insists on fighting even though he is seriously injured. Hwarang explained that all the participants in the tournament had a strong desire and reason to win the tournament, so it was not surprising that they would fight to the death. In the next battle, Xiaoyu will fight against a female assassin named Nina Williams. Jin warns Xiaoyu to always be vigilant because Nina is very dangerous, but she is not afraid of his warning. When the fight begins, Jin asks Heihachi why Xiaoyu is allowed to participate in the tournament even though she is still very young and doesn't have much experience. But Heihachi denied this and said that despite her young age and small body, Xiaoyu was the fighter with the best strategy among all the tournament participants. And what he said was actually proven by her in the battle arena. Xiaoyu managed to take advantage of all existing gaps to overcome all enemy attacks and counterattack at the opponent's blind spot. Xiaoyu beat Nina until she fainted and came out victorious in the round. On the next day, Jin had to fight back in the arena, and in this duel, he had to face his friend, Hwarang. When the fight begins, memories of his mother suddenly appear and make Jin remember that he must fight against the ogre to avenge the death of his mother. Although at first Jin had been beaten badly by Hwarang, the memory of his mother had motivated Jin to get up and turn to attack him. After repeatedly striking the Hwarang with multiple punches and kicks, he ended the fight with a powerful internal attack. Seeing Hwarang collapse, Jin intends to kill him. Thankfully, he regained his senses and carried Hwarang out of the battle arena. The third round of battles is held in an open area in the middle of the forest, and this match will open with a duel between Xiaoyu and a masked tiger fighter named King. However, unlike the previous fight, in this fight she seemed very overwhelmed by dealing with every attack from King. He even managed to slam her body to the ground repeatedly and won the match by a landslide. King is a very tough fighter with attack techniques that are very difficult for other fighters to imitate. Even he managed to make Jin stunned with his victory in the duel fight against Paul. Paul is one of the strongest fighters who have abilities on par with Kazuya, so it's not surprising that Jin looked very surprised when King managed to beat Paul. That night after Heihachi finished meeting with his research team, a girl named Julia suddenly appeared and immediately attacked Heihachi. Before he could issue a dangerous attack on her, Jin, who happened to see that, immediately stopped Heihachi. Jin said that he would take care of Julia alone and ensure that she would not create chaos in the place. Hearing this, Heihachi decided to leave the place and reminded him to be careful because she was a murderer. After Heihachi left, Julia explained that she had come to the place to take her mother's locket that he had taken. She also wanted to investigate whether Heihachi was involved in her mother's disappearance a few months ago. The genie who knew about the locket asked her to give them a little time until they managed to find the demon ogre using the locket. Knowing that Jin promised he would return the ring and help Julia find her mother after he managed to find and kill the ogre he had been looking for. After hearing his story about the ogre who killed his mother, Julia said that the martial arts teacher of the participant, named King, was also killed by the ogre demon. But unlike Jin, who fights for revenge against the ogre, King fights to win the tournament money to fund the orphanage. In the final match, Jin must fight against King, who is the strongest candidate in the tournament. King uses a wrestling fighting style to lock up Jin's movement and limit his attacks, but he can still maintain to get out of King's grip. Unfortunately, King is a very formidable opponent. He managed to beat Jin repeatedly, making Jin suffer severe injuries. After being thrown hard enough, Jin got back up and tried to focus his thoughts to create a red electric aura around his body. At that moment, the situation began to reverse as Jin managed to block all of King's attacks and issued a counterattack so powerful that it sent King flying into the air. After defeating King, Jin approached King and said that he would give King all the money he won so that King could build his orphanage. Heihachi looked annoyed that the ogre didn't show up even after the match. He decided to fight against Jin to be able to lure all the power of the devil's genes within Jin's body. The battle between Heihachi, the first generation of the Kazama family, and Jin, the third generation of the Kazama family, looks fierce. At the start of the match, Heihachi seemed superior to Jin due to his greater physical strength and more fighting experience than him. Heihachi even used his inner strength to attack Jin, causing him to be thrown against the arena wall very hard. At that moment, Jin recalled his mother's words that he would not be able to defeat a bigger opponent just by relying on strength. After remembering all that, Jin launched various surprise attacks at Heihachi and managed to push Heihachi back with various Kazama attack techniques. Just as he managed to knock Heihachi to the ground, the pendant in Heihachi's hand suddenly started to emit a green glow. It turned out to be a sign that the demon ogre would appear from above the sky and come to Earth to defeat Jin. Seeing this, Xiaoyu and Waring tried to help Jin defeat the demon ogre, but Heihachi held them back because it was a battle that Jin was destined to face alone. After a fierce battle, Jin finally managed to defeat the ogre and thought it was all over. But as it turned out, the ogre was still able to revive and transform into a much bigger demon. Jin was overwhelmed to face the ogre's attack alone and almost died in the fight. Then Xiaoyu, Waring, and other fighters tried to fight against the ogre, but its strength was too great. Jin recalled all the memories of his mother, who had died, which made him determined to take revenge on the ogre. Jin, overcome by anger and revenge, had begun to be affected by the devil's genes within him, and his eyes had turned red. Heihachi realized that Jin had been completely overpowered by the devil's genes, so he decided to kill Jin with a shot aimed right at Jin's chest. After Jin died, he returned to see his mother, who had seemed peaceful in another world. When he looks at his mother, Jin apologizes because he prefers to drown in the devil's genes to take revenge on Heihachi, who has lured the ogre into the world. After Jin rose in demon form, he attacked Heihachi repeatedly with deadly fists. In his dying state, Heihachi said that a true Mishima would kill his opponent right away, but Jin chose to stop his attack and let Heihachi live in misery. After throwing the pendant at Xiaoyu, Jin immediately flew away from the place because he felt he was not worthy of being with them. The moral that can be learned from this anime is that not everyone in our family or the people closest to us can be trusted.